Welcome to the Clean Your Bike webinar. I've brought you down to my bike room, which is also my laundry room. We're going to keep today pretty basic. And the reason for that is there are so many types of bikes that are out there. There are road bikes with disc brakes. There are mountain bikes with canty brakes. There are bikes with one gear, bikes with multiple gears, bikes with fat tires, skinny tires, whatever it might be. So I want to make sure that today's lesson covers what is pertinent to you and your ride. That said, if you have any specific questions, feel free to pop it in the chat. We'll try to leave some space at the end, and maybe we'll pop it out there. And then we're always reachable. You can email us at bikeinfo@massbike.org, or you can reach out to Crystal, Jess, or myself, just at our first name at massbike.org to follow up. So again, welcome to my bike room, my laundry room. And the reason I'm doing this, as opposed to going to a bike shop, is that most of you don't have a bike shop in your house. Although props to those of you who do, that's wonderful. But I'm going to try to do everything today without a bike stand. I do have a bike stand just in case we need it. And if there's anything more in depth, I might also recommend your local bike shop is there for you. So you have local bike shops, you have local professionally trained folks who will go through anything in particular. If you're noticing a rattle, if you're noticing a wobble, if you're noticing a noise, which seems unfamiliar, we want to make sure that your bike is safe to ride. And that's going to be the goal of today, is making sure that it's safe to ride with the basics while keeping in mind some of the wear and tear that your bike will naturally happen as you ride out in the roads, paths, and mountains. And especially important in the winter, I'm going to kind of keep harping on this, is that if you are riding out there in February, especially today and this weekend, you will be riding through sand and salt. Those are the two biggest things to keep in mind when you are cleaning your bike in the wintertime, because the sand will get into the componentry, get into the chain, get into the gearing system, and start to wear away your components. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And the salt, of course, will eat away all the steel componentry, which even if you have an aluminum bike, even if you've got a carbon bike, I guarantee you there is steel exposed on your bike. The drivetrain, chains, chain rings, pedals, all that stuff, all steel, will all get eaten away through the salt if you allow it to sit and settle. So just want to keep in mind, again, sand and salt are the big things to battle. And then we'll talk a bit about the basic maintenance, which every single one of you is required to keep in mind when you are doing your bike riding. There is a lot to cover. So again, we'll cover the ABCs, just the basics. But this is also a taste of you being able to dive into some of the more in-depth aspects of what might be possible with your bike. We'll talk a little bit about the materials required for today's lesson, which again, very basic. So to start, I'll start with my attire. I'm wearing a dark shirt. Black shirts are great because they never get dirty. And if you get grease on it, that's okay. Don't worry about it. You can also go so far as to get like a nice apron. I'm probably not going to wear this, but I'll show you. This is like a nice little apron you can wear. Get yourself something that will protect you, that will cover you. Park Tool makes a great one, but just for the sake of a little bit of slapstick, I don't necessarily need to have that on the whole time. We are going to need rags. Number one friend of cleaning your bike. You got to clean it off with something. I prefer Bike Month t-shirts from years past. So if you've come to a Bike Month event, I highly recommend getting the extra large shirts, or maybe the double extra large shirts whenever you're at an event, because you can tear them up and make more rags out of them. However, maybe you want to wear it, but I've always tried to have an extra t-shirt or two when I'm at an event, because these come in handy to clean off your bike. Second, you're going to need some solvent. I'm going to recommend something along the lines of, this is a Pedro's brand, it's called Green Fizz. Basically like a simple green, a very basic solvent. It's lightweight. It doesn't actually eat into a lot of the grease and stuff, but it will get the dirt, the sludge, the slush, the sand, and the salt that we're going to try to take off. So try to get something as a solvent. If you want to go so far as to get a degreaser, here's a bottle of a degreasing agent. Again, this is also a Pedro's brand. I don't really care which brand you get as long as it's bike specific. This stuff is if you were actually going to go and soak some componentry, or go in there and get at the inner workings of the gears. Maybe it's a cassette, which is a gear cluster in the back. You're going to want to get something that will actually eat away at some of that grease that's built up. I'm not going to go into this too much today, but I'm happy to answer any questions about it, because The thing about solvents is that it's only one half of the equation. Once you get rid of that grime and the grease and the buildup, you then have to clean off the solvent, and then you have to reapply lubrication. You have to re-grease things back up. So in the interest of time, I'll talk a little bit about what degreasers can really go for, but really I'm going to stick to something like the green fizz. And again, this is bike specific. You can get whatever it is. Some people use just simple green, but dilute it to make sure it's a pretty light thing, because you don't necessarily want too much of a solvent on a bike, because you need to have things greased up in order for them to run without wearing themselves apart. And then thirdly, you're going to want to get some sort of lubrication. So I'm going to stick with the basics of chain lube, and I'm going to use them for much of my componentry of my bike if I'm cleaning just the exterior. This is a brand, again, Pedro's, but it's called Enduro. It's kind of a lighter weight. You can see it's a little hard to see, but it's a pretty light, looks like olive oil. Or you can get something thicker. This is a rock and roll brand. It's called Extreme. It's made for extreme circumstances like the sleet, the sand, the snow, and the harder stuff. And you can see it's even got a little wax base to it. So I do need to shake it up and make it a thicker lubricant. And the reason why you have different styles of lubrication is that different needs in different conditions in different weathers. If you are only a 3-season rider or a 1-season rider, totally fine. You might be totally fine just getting away with the thinner of the stuff. Just keep in mind that if you use thinner lubrication, still bike specific, but if you use thin stuff, you're going to need to reapply it more regularly. It doesn't last as long. However, it does a good job of cleaning out the chain, cleaning out the gears, and a little bit of the cabling. So I'm actually going to use today a little bit of both of these to show you a little bit of what I do in the wintertime of the thicker stuff and the thinner stuff, and I use it on different parts of the bike, the chain, as well as a little bit of lubrication for the cables, because the thing about wintertime, especially if you're riding out there when it's wet, is the cables can actually get moist and get wet inside the cable in the housing, and they can freeze up and prevent you from doing effective braking, effective shifting. So that's one thing we're going to keep in mind too. So you need, again, some sort of lubrication, some sort of solvent, and then a good old rag that you're going to make completely black. And then again, for myself and my body, I'm going to wear a black shirt. This is my Ride for Black Lives t-shirt, which is awesome. And to clean up, I also recommend something like lava soap. I'll show you this in a little bit. This is basically bar soap that's made to clean off grease from your hands. This is absolutely key if you want to touch things after you've cleaned your bike. So again, think about the bike, think about the body, and we want to keep us all nice and clean. Cool. And with that, I'll go into a little bit about this bike here, and then we'll dive into different types of bikes about what we're doing. Feel free to populate in the chat, and Jess, because I'm not paying attention to the chat, I'm going to encourage you as our communications director here to just interrupt me at any point of whatever might be pertinent. Great. Cool. So let me introduce you to my mountain bike here. This is essentially my winter bike. And I like this bike because it is simple, it's easy, everything's out there, it's pretty. Oh, I'm seeing wearing gloves. I should see that too. Yes, I do have a set of, I forgot to mention too, protecting the body. Having some rubber gloves does go a long way too. I'll probably put these on right now.
We also have a query about how you feel about using WD-40 as a degreaser.
Great question. So WD-40, and I should show you, maybe I'll use this camera here, but I do have like a whole little pack of other stuff that I'm not necessarily going to dive into if I were going to doing too much. WD-40 is fine, and I do have a can of it here, and this unsticks rust. So if you've got something that's really hard and sticky, WD-40 is a really good job of unseizing some of that stuff. The trouble is if you only use WD-40, what happens is you aren't actually applying lubrication, you're only applying the solvent. So I would put this in the same category as the degreaser and the green fizz, depending on the needs of what kind of stuff you're trying to degrease. But I do think WD-40 is something that's handy that you should probably have in your kit, just in case something is totally seized up. Like say you want to get a pedal off, say you need to get a crank off or something that's really seized in because of the threading, WD-40 will help. However, once you've done that, you need to then re-grease it. And whether it's a chain, you'll need a chain lube, or whether it's a pedal, then you can use kind of a thicker poly lube. This is something that is not made for chains. This is like a goopy, like really thick polymer lubricant for putting in things that are threaded. So the short answer is WD-40 is great, but it's only half of the equation. You really then need to also find a way to grease things up afterwards. Cool. So about my bike. So things to keep in mind about this bike. Maybe I'll just keep this camera on. So things to consider are the cabling systems, the chain systems, the rotational systems, and the way that the external componentry is exposed. So you'll see on this bike, it's a little bit iffy for a winter bike because it's got so much to it. It's got a lot of drivetrain. It's got 3 gears in the front, and 8 gears in the back. It's got a big derailleur system that allows the chain to shift, which is good for riding. However, it just needs to be extra important that I'm cleaning this stuff off because this is what collects all of the sand and all of the salt. I've also got braking systems, which are on the rim. These are rim brakes. These are cantilever rim brakes. And you'll see that they're actually pretty wide here, which means that they can collect a lot of that slush and sand and salt and such. And every time I do end up braking, if there's debris in between my brake pad and my rim, what happens is I start to wear away my brake pad. I start to wear away my rim. And so if I leave that nice and grimy, what I'm going to end up doing is prematurely wearing out that componentry. So along with cleaning off the chain and the gear systems, you're going to want to keep in mind about cleaning off where the brakes occur on the bike. Now, some bikes have the brake mechanism at the wheel, at the hub, with a disc brake, and we can cover that shortly. But for the start, we'll talk about the rim style brakes. That's probably most popular and most common. And then there's a few types of brake systems. This one's called cantilever, which basically it's just the way the brake mechanism works. A little hard to see because my reflector is right here, but it kind of like applies pressure on both sides of the brake arms, and there's a lot of space. If you have a road bike, you might have a caliper brake system where it's kind of more enclosed. There's not so much space, which means that stuff can collect but not get clear, but less stuff might collect, but keep in mind there. And then, if you have a coaster brake where you actually backpedal, that's not something that would necessarily get, grimy in the wintertime or out in ride time, but something to keep in mind that you do need to make sure your braking systems are in good stead. And then, so chains, the brakes, and then the wheel and the rotational systems as well. So you'll see that as I spin my wheel, I want to make sure that it's clean, that it's free of debris, especially around the hub. And you can actually get down and start to clean off some of the stuff because that does start to collect. And you can see that as things will rotate, they'll start to kind of attract the grime that you're riding through. So that's something to keep in mind as well. This is a little bit like the ABCs, which we've covered in prior webinars: air, brakes, and chain. Now that's more inclined to say, okay, do I have enough air in my tires? How are my brakes? Am I doing okay with my barrel adjusters? Can I stop quickly? And then is my chain clean and lubricated, and can it shift? That same mentality of doing the ABC check every time before you ride, you do squeezing of the tires, checking of the brakes, and a little spin of the wheels to make sure that the chain is rotating and clean. Doesn't sound like a family of mice. That same idea of keeping track of the ABCs applies to how to clean your bike as well. At least that's how I approach it. That's kind of my mentality, kind of how I've been trained. So yeah, a little bit about this mountain bike, and then I'll show you a few other bikes that I have here just before I get moving. This is a winter bike. This is my winter bike, and you can see it's very similar in a sense to the mountain bike in terms of the hand brakes with cable pull activation. This is a caliper brake system, but it's on the rim brake. A couple things about this bike is you'll see it's only a single gear in the rear, which means I don't have a derailleur system, which means I don't have an external gear cluster. This is much more simple to clean and make sure is in good stead. And then a couple more things about this while I have it. You can see that there are studs on these tires. I don't know if you can see that, but that allows me to ride on the ice and snow. And it's a basic bike, it's a cheap bike, it's an easy bike, and it's a bike that I can beat up and not worry about. So if you want to go so far as to get yourself a specific bike for riding in the rough conditions, highly recommend it if you got the ability to. I know not everybody can have multiple bikes via space and cost and all that, but if you have a nice bike that you love intensely, and you ride it throughout the winter, you're going to need to maybe replace the chain, replace the brakes, and replace the cabling and the spring. It just happens. That's just how it goes. Great. And yeah, I'm seeing there's fenders. Yeah, people are calling out the fenders. This is kind of like, I could talk a little bit more about my winter bike. You'll see I've got big platform pedals, which allow for my boots to get their traction on there pretty nicely. I've got little reflective strips kind of interspersed throughout. So I'm a little bit more poppy when I'm out there in the dark, because it gets dark earlier, and if it's snowing, it's really kind of obscured for the drivers. This makes a little more pop. And I've got a basket in the front so I can carry like extra clothes or extra layers, so that if I'm riding, I get hot, I can take off a layer, or if it's cold, I can put on a layer. Yeah, there's a lot about just the winter bike itself that I could get into, but just want to show you a little bit of differences. The main difference, again, is mainly the gearing system of how I just have a single gear. And then snag myself. And then I'll show you, tight in my bike rooms. My apologies for going off screen here. I'll show you a little bit about this touring bike, which I'll talk about a little bit about the disc brakes. So you'll see that the disc brakes here in the center of the hub, that's going to require basically a specific cleaning with rubbing alcohol only. I only recommend rubbing alcohol when cleaning off disc brakes. I can talk about that shortly. And then you'll see that the way that the brakes and the shifting mechanisms work, it's all integrated in through these levers. So it's actually more tough to get at it if it starts to get sticky, if these start to freeze up due to water. So I'll go through a little bit of my quick hacks in our demo about how I'm actually going to make sure that these don't freeze up and don't stick on me, because these are cable pull brakes, which means there's a cable that needs to slide through housing, and sometimes that freezes up. Things I'm not going to cover today, I'm not really going to cover hydraulic brake systems. That's where there's a hydraulic line, like a fluid line from the brakes down to from the levers down to the brakes themselves. That's well beyond what I can do in my basement. I would recommend, if you need to check your hydraulic brakes and you're unfamiliar with it, go to a local bike shop, have the bike mechanics take a look at it for you, have them step you through the process so you know what's going on with the hydraulic brakes, because they do recommend that you bleed the brakes and check them pretty regularly, as well. But it's more nuanced than I can really get at while I'm here during this quick and easy webinar. Great. So with that, let's dive into my mountain bike. And I'll take a quick pause. Jess, is there anything to mention that's coming in on the chat that I should pay attention to?
Someone says they have drum brakes, not disc brakes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Drum brakes are great too. They're also in the hub, and the way that drum brakes work is that they're all basically encapsulated. So they're very protected. The thing about drum brakes is that they're hard to service unless you're really good at it. By all means, go check it out, go try it. But usually they also work from a cable pull system. So I don't know much if I can talk about the drum brake itself as it stops in the hub. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with drum brake, if you've ever ridden one of the blue bike share bikes, those are drum brake style bikes where the stopping mechanism is actually inside of the hub to slow down the wheel. It still uses friction, but it's all basically in metal. So it's protected from the sand, the salt, and all the rain and stuff. However, it still requires a cable to pull in order to activate. And that's where I'll talk about shortly about how to keep those cables nice and lubricated so that they don't freeze up, because that's happened to me in the past as well. Cool, good question. I appreciate that. All right, so let's start with the chain itself, and then we'll work our way back. So the thing about the chain that I should mention is that you do need to keep it regularly cleaned with the 4-step process that you should do, even in the good conditions, which is you clean it off, you wipe it down, you lubricate it, you keep it nice and greasy, and then you let it sit to let the chain lube soak through the chain and kind of get all through all the components of it. And then you wipe it down again. It's a 4-step process. Clean it off with an initial wipe, apply lubricant, wait, and then reapply it. So I'll go do that with this bike here. And actually I might use, I'll use this bike since I have it right here to show you what's going on. before I do that, I'll show you a little bit about my wooden chain link. So I love this tool because it shows you what's going on in the fine-tuned nature of the chain itself. So the idea of the chain is that there's a lot of tiny little components that all rotate and all move. There's the outer plates, you can see here. You have the inner plates here, and they interlock with a pin, and that's connected with a little roller. Now, this metal, obviously, this wooden model, obviously, is kind of not to scale, but to show you a little bit of the mechanism of what to keep in mind when you are cleaning your chain. Yeah, I wish I had a wooden bike. You should see the Trojan horse bike that this chain comes off of. Really is like, maybe we'll get it going by bike month. We'll get a giant wooden bike to match the rest of this chain. I'm going to dissect this and put it back together so you understand what's going on with your rotational systems. I also want to preface by saying the things you want to keep in mind when you're cleaning your bike are all the stuff that's moving, that's rotating. And though you might think that your bike moves a lot, there's only a few actual components that spin, that move. There's the chain and parts of the drivetrain, which we'll focus on in just a moment. There's the wheel that spins. There's the cranks and the pedals that spin. And then there's the steering and the headset. Those are the only rotational systems on a bike. Everything else is pretty static. So you've got to keep in mind the rotational systems will wear down and they will need to be serviced over time. There are ball bearings in these headsets that need to be replaced and re-greased over time. The axle and the spindle that connect your pedals do wear out. The ball bearings in there do wear out. You need to replace those every so often. Like I'm talking thousands of miles. If you haven't serviced it and it's a new bike, not a big deal, but just something to keep in mind. And then, you know, of course, the hubs of the wheels as well. We're not going to get into that. That's definitely like a 2 or 3.0 level. But to keep in mind what does move and what does rotate also wears out. And the thing that you should know, just while I'm on this tangent, you can really check how worn down they are by how much they wiggle. And you want to keep in mind that most of the bike is not really moving very much. If you're noticing a wobble or a shake, chances are something in the rotational system needs to be serviced, needs to be re-greased. Sometimes the ball bearings need to be replaced. Not an expensive part, but it's expensive to get at it. You need specific tools, you need specific know-how, and you need somebody who's trained at it to make sure that you put it back together properly. I am guilty of not necessarily following my own advice, and highly recommend leaning on your local bike shop if this is unfamiliar to you. But the way that you would check it is, are the rotational components wobbling? Is the headset wobbling? One way you can check is you can squeeze the brakes, kind of give your bike a shake. If there's a knocking, then you need to get your headset checked. You can grab your cranks here that hold your pedals, and you can kind of wobble them back and forth. If there's knocking, you got to get it checked out. And the same thing for the wheels. You grab a wheel, remember you have 2 wheels, make sure you do it on 2, and you kind of rock your wheel back and forth like this. If you're noticing it's knocking and rocking back and forth, you need to get it serviced. If you let it sit and be loose and wobble around, it's going to destroy itself. And then you're going to have a failure. You're going to be walking home during a bike ride, and then you're going to cost a lot more money in fixing it at a bike shop. So keep that in mind. The rotational systems do need to be regularly checked. You can kind of knock your headset to see if there's any wobble, rock your wheels back and forth to see if there's any wobble, check them on both, and then the same thing for the crank. But that said, that's well beyond what we're going to cover today. Let's talk about the chain itself. Back to the chain. So I love this because you can show you what's going on inside of the chain. I'll pop this pin out, boom, and then I'll separate out the outer plate from the inner plate, and then I'll show you in the inner plate kind of what's going on. And again, this is a representation of what's going on. If you've ever dissected your chain, you'll see that this is very familiar. And you have these rollers. What happens when you're riding, generally over time, is that you'll need to have grease, lubrication inside of here in order for the rollers to actually smoothly roll. In order for the chain to fit together, you'll need to make sure that it's kind of more or less free of debris. Now, it's hard to get this free of debris because it's so exposed. It's always out in the elements. It's always out in the salt, in the sand, in the rust, in the rain, and all the stuff that comes with it. So regularly, even in the good weather, you're going to need to clean and lubricate your chain maybe once every month and a half at the very least. But if it's been a particularly rainy week and you've been riding to work, clean your chain, clean your drivetrain, and get all that gunk off of it. We'll talk about how in a second. Secondly, once the componentry gets full of grime, there's a lot of friction that moves in here. You can imagine if there's sand inside of these rollers, every rotation that the chain makes, every little movement of the hundreds of thousands of pedal strokes that you go through wears away the metal inside of the chain. And actually this pin, this roller, and all the inside componentry of the chain actually wears away, and they'll start to hollow out. So the rollers will start to get thinner. The little bump that holds the rollers in place on the plates start to wear away, and the pin itself will start to get divots, which leads to what we call wiggle, chain wiggle or chain slack. And what it is basically your chain gets stretched, but it's a misnomer. Your chain's not actually being stretched. What's happening is the inner metal that holds your chain together just starts to wear down, and your chain, based off the tension that it's under, feels like it's stretched out. But basically your chain becomes really wiggly and really wobbly. And that's a problem, because you need to make sure that your chain is strong because of all of the force that your pedal strokes, your legs are very powerful, are being able to, be translated and transmuted throughout the entire chain. But also, as it wiggles, it doesn't have a lot of structural integrity. And if you think about how chains shift from one gear to another, and I'll show you here if I can get close enough on my demo. As the chain will actually shift from one part of the cassette to another, you'll see that the chain itself needs to actually skip in between gears. And if I am on a really weak and wobbly chain, it's not going to index properly. It's not going to shift properly. It's not going to do what I need it to do. And if I am in between gears and I put a big pedal stroke down, I'm sure this has happened to you at some point, your chain skips forward, your chain skips, and you lose your resistance, and you can actually buck yourself off your bike. You can actually break your chain, or you can chip the teeth of your cogs. That's why it's super important to make sure your chain is not worn out. And the best way to make sure it's not worn out is to make sure that there's not debris inside of it. And the best way to make sure there's not debris inside of it is to keep it clean. And then to also realize every so often, you got to replace the chain. The chain will wear out. It may be once a season, maybe once every 2 seasons. You get a new chain, and the bike shop will help you out there because they can actually measure how stretched or worn out your chain actually is.
I have a question about what the warning signs might be that your chain is getting stretched. Will it affect the gearing at all?
Great question. It's a little bit of a complex system because they all interrelate. But again, if you shift and your chain doesn't necessarily go from one gear to another gear, it could be that your chain needs to be cleaned off, lubricated. And if you've done the good job of cleaning and it's still not shifting properly, you might need to go to a bike shop and get it measured. They can actually have a little measuring tool, which they drop in a chain. All chains are universally lengthed, so they'll tell you how stretched your chain is. And it's done in a matter of millimeters. So it's a very fine degree of wear that they're measuring. The other thing to keep in mind is that depending on the type of bike that you have, if you have a cable pull system for the shifters, like I have here, well, I have grip shifters, and every time I change my shifting, it pulls a cable. You can actually change a little bit of the tension of the cable on how much the chain will actually jump from one chain to another. That's called indexing. That's not necessarily related to chain stretch, but they are all interconnected. So some of the things that I look for when I'm noticing my chain is probably wearing out is every time I shift, the chain might not shift quickly, or it might take a couple of pedal strokes for it to kind of lock into place, or it has that kind of whir, whir, whir in between gears. That's one thing I keep in mind. And then you can also, if you're so inclined, actually grab your chain. A little hard to see. Maybe I can, well, I'll bring my light a little closer. You can actually grab your chain and wiggle it, kind of just like wiggle it like you would wiggle the headset or the wheel to see if the hub is loose. And if the chain is hard, again, it's kind of, you have to know it from muscle memory, but you can get familiar with what a new chain feels like and how stiff it is versus a worn out chain, and you can have a lot of wiggle to it. I don't have it here, but at a prior bike shop I used to work for, we had a chain demo that people could see of a worn out chain, a half worn out chain, and a brand new chain. And what we would do is we would let each chain kind of like droop over itself, and the new chains are pretty stiff and they don't bend very much, whereas the worn out chains would have a big droop to them based off the amount of just space and wiggle that's going on between the rollers and the pins. So it's a little hard to answer, and I'm going to ask if anybody else has some other tips and tricks to pop it in the chat too, because again, I'm not the only resource here. I'm just hosting, and hopefully that we've got some folks here who want to chime in. How do you know when your chain is worn out? Cool.
We also have a viewer who wants to know the difference between how often things need to be cleaned based on a bike. For example, they have a single speed bike with the backpedaling brake.
I would say cleaning your chain is a regular thing. Everybody needs to do it just the same. If you have a single speed bike, make sure, especially if you're riding in the salt and sand, that you kind of clean it off and then keep it moving. Okay, let's keep this moving. So let's start with the chain. I've got my rag here, and this is my 4-step process of the wipe, lube, wait, and wipe process. So the easy way to do that, if you don't have a lot of space like I have, is just kind of lean your bike up somewhere that will not fall over. Take my rag, and I'll hold the bottom part of my chain and the upper part of my chain, and I'll kind of backpedal. And if I ever drop my chain, let me see if I can actually switch my cameras. Hold on one second, detail. I wonder if we can make this happen. Cool. Can you see me from my other camera here? Cool. We'll see if this works. I basically am grabbing the bottom part of my chain and rubbing as such, and the top part of my chain. Let's see if I can get, my light is not the best in here. My apologies. I'll drop this down a bit. And if the chain ever falls off, which happens pretty regularly if you're cleaning your chain, you can kind of just pull the chain and put it right back on. One thing you'll notice on this bike, which you can see maybe with this light, there's a lot of grime and grit, which is right in on the teeth. So along with cleaning off my chain, I'm going to want to wipe down the teeth of the cogs and make sure that they are as clean as possible too. It's a 4-step process of wiping it down, lubing it up, waiting, and wiping. So I'll get at it. And this could be done for about the course of an hour or more, or all afternoon, or all day. And the more that I will rub, the more grit and grime I'm going to get off. This is the very, very basics. I'm also going to want to wipe down my what's called the bottom bracket area, which is kind of where all the stuff will collect, right where the down tube and the seat tube come in. And I'm just kind of wiping the top of the chain, wiping the bottom of the chain. And what I'm trying to get at is the tops, the sides, and the bottoms as much as possible. It's like brushing your teeth before going to the dentist, just kind of getting it all done. Once I've done that, secondarily, I'll grab my chain lube. So again, I've got a bunch of different lubes. We'll work on, maybe I'll use this kind. This is the Enduro. It's kind of the thinner stuff, just for the sake of purpose. And then one thing I will also do is make it more reachable by actually shifting into my hardest gear, which in the front moves the chain towards the furthest out chain ring, and on the back moves the chain to the furthest out chain ring as well. So I can more easily access my chain from the outside. So I'll shift a few times and go to the outside. And now you can see that I've got the chain jamming right there. I typically don't use a degreasing agent on my chain, mainly because it's such a fine-tuned and small piece of componentry that typically, if I'm using a thin lubricant, will soak its way through the chain. And as I'm applying the lubricant, it will soak through the chain, and that acts almost as a solvent just the same and saves me a step in the process. So the way that I'll apply the chain lube, after I've wiped it down, and again, I'm not going to do this fully because I could spend as much time, depending if I'm a type A person or a type B person. But imagine that I've actually gone down and made this blue rag completely black. Next, I'll take my chain grease and literally apply it. Again, if you're a type A person, you want to do link by link, and I can actually apply it drop by drop. You want about 1 drop, only about 1 drop of the chain lube needs to be put on the chain itself. If you're a type A person, drop by drop, or if you're a type B person like me, you kind of get a good spin going, find a good spot where you're going to not get in your own way, and just kind of make sure that you're essentially hitting every link. Some folks go so far as to do the tops of the chains, and then they'll come down here and do the bottoms of the chains. But the idea is it doesn't really quite matter as long as there's 1 drop per link and that's more or less equally distributed to get at it. And again, what your goal is to do is to make sure that it soaks through where the rollers, the pin, and the plates are meeting. So if you're not hitting there, you've got to make sure that that is an extra important spot to hit. You don't really need grease. You don't really need lubrication on any of the exterior. You really are only trying to get it, again, where the pins and rollers meet. So you apply the lubricant. 4th step is waiting. Maybe I'll run my chain. Maybe I'll shift a little bit. Maybe I'll do 1 small bike ride to go out. And the idea there is it works the chain lube through the chain. And then the 4th step, again, same as the first, is just wiping it down because you actually don't need any lubrication on the exterior of the chain. You really only need it where the chain is meeting up with the rollers and the pins. And then while I'm doing this, I'll make sure that I'm getting all the grime and gunk from the teeth of the cogs. One great little trick that I like to use as well is get a piece of cardboard. Cardboard is some of my best friends for getting at the internal of the teeth and the cogs. What I'll do is I'll also kind of get deep in there and just kind of start to get some of that grime out if it's really stuck. I could apply degreasing agent. I could put some of this orange degreaser on it, and so that there's extra solvent on the cardboard, or maybe I'll use a rag. But what I'm trying to do is kind of get at the in-between of the gears, because that's where a lot of that stuff does collect. I like cardboard because it's stiff enough, and then I can trash it. And then if you want to go so far as to give it a couple of sprays with the Simple Green, I don't like to do this on my chain itself, but what I will like to do is put this around the cogs, around the bottom bracket, around the chain, the chain stays, around the back, because again, where the drivetrain is, and the drivetrain is the pedal, the crank, the chain, and the derailleur systems, that's where a lot of the stuff starts to collect. So I'll wipe this down if it's the Simple Green, and then I'll still do my due diligence of making sure that my chain is wiped down as well. This is a quick demo. I would actually honestly spend probably a good half an hour on this part, and this is probably the most important part to do. But just to give you a mind, this is key, absolutely key, to make sure that your chain, your cogs are in good condition and you're cleaning off the gunk. The cardboard also works really well in the back of the cassette area. So maybe I'll pull this to the rear. You can kind of get at in between of the cogs using some good piece of cardboard. And if you get really diligent about it, you'll start to get off all that grime, which is very key to get off. Anything that's on the exterior and outside of the cassette or outside of the chain or outside of the stays needs to come off, can come off. You don't really need that to be at all lubricated. You really only need the lubrication inside the chain itself. All right. I realize we went a little bit long on the chain aspect of things. I just want to make sure that that's done pretty regularly and that you are keeping your mind on what is the most delicate and most important thing to keep moving, which is the go of the bike, which is the chain. A couple other things about the drivetrain as well. You have some exterior componentry that I like to kind of just keep regularly lubricated. So one thing I also like to have, this is called T9. It's a lubrication, but I use a spray version of it. And the reason that I use a spray version is because I can actually zip a little bit into where the springs and cabling systems are, especially in my derailleur. So I'll grab a spray bottle, and this is a bike-specific lubricant. Doesn't matter what you use, but again, I recommend a lubrication and not WD-40. If you do use WD-40, you'll just have to kind of lubricate it afterwards. And anywhere where there's like an exposed spring, for instance, right around here, where my derailleur system is, and a little hard to see here, but you can kind of get where the springs are. I don't know if that's visible in there. and where the, let me get you here, where you can kind of see with my derailleur system, I'm sorry, this is hard to do AV and everything all together. There's a lot of exposed metal and exposed componentry and cabling here. So just where the spring is, I will do a quick little dab of lubrication and keep it moving. And the same for in the front, you can kind of see the systems of my front derailleur has a bunch of screws and springs and cabling systems coming in there. So I'll grab a little bit of this spray degreaser and just kind of do a little dab inside of the derailleur system and just let it settle and just kind of let it sit. And then I might move my shifter back and forth to kind of get it worked in. It's a similar concept as to what we need to do with the chain, but I don't necessarily worry about cleaning it off afterwards. Let me see here. Cool. So again, cleaning off the chain, cleaning off the cogs, doing a little bit of dab of the spray lubrication, I should say, in the derailleur systems in the front and in the rear. Along those same lines, I'll also keep in mind where the cabling system is. So while I have my grease out, I'll keep in mind that my cables, especially on this bike, you can see that they're very exposed. They are on the external here where my brake mechanisms come in. I can actually unhook my brake cables and add a little bit of solvent and a little bit of lubrication to make sure that my cabling systems are nice and greased as well. So just like I would with, let me do this here just so I get a few aspects here. Cool, I'll turn off my phone so you can go ahead and just see this one camera here. One thing that I'll keep in mind that I can do is if you are keen on it and your bike has the ability to, you can actually unhook some of the cabling systems as long as you are familiar with how to put them back on. And to allow you the ability, I'll just do it with my front brake system, so just so you get an idea, allows you to get at the cabling mechanism and the housing so you can apply some grease. So because I know how to pull off my cable and unhook it, you can see now that I've detached my front brake cable. What that allows me to do is it allows me a little bit of a gap between the cable and the housing. In that gap, I can actually put a little bit of lubrication, the same T9 spray bottle, or I could use the drip. What I'll do is I'll just do a little dab in the cable, and it will actually seep its way through the cable and the housing. Now, the benefit of that is that if there's any moisture within my cabling system, that prevents this flow between the brakes and the brake cable and the brake housing. The lubrication will actually fill that gap. And so my brake cables won't freeze, my brake cables won't rust. So if you have the ability to get at a little bit of a gap in your cabling system, most people don't realize this, is that you can just do a little bit of grease agent. And I could do this, again, I'd probably add a little bit more. For the interest of time, I won't. But the idea to make it a little bit slick inside of the cabling system. And I could also do the same for my derailleur systems if I know how to unhook it. And then lastly, for the cabling systems, well, of course, you got to put it back in. I'll do that afterwards. I really like to have these spray bottles as well, so that if there's a hiccup inside of, say, my grip shifter, or say with my shifter mechanism, I can actually find a little bit of a gap depending on the type of system that you have. I'll do this with my other bike, but you can actually kind of give a good spray inside of the shifters and inside of the actual brake levers. So if there's gunk, if there's buildup in there, this stuff does a really good job of breaking it down and instead applying lubrication. So I'll demonstrate that with my other bike in a moment, just because it's a little bit easier and I want to get to disc brakes as well. So again, to back it up, keep it as debris free as possible, and you can get creative. Cardboard does a great job at getting in the teeth of the cogs and in the teeth of the cassettes. You can also use a brush. You can use, what else might I have here? You can get bike specific brushes, but something that kind of gets at it that's soft, something that is weaker than the componentry. So make sure it's not metal, make sure it's plastic, make sure it's cardboard, because you don't want to be able to scratch or damage your components. Clean it off. then you lubricate it, and then let it sit for a little bit, and then you'll wipe it down again. That's specifically for the chain and the drivetrain. And then you could add a little bit of a dab to keep the springs of the derailleur system nice and springy, and then get a little dab of the cabling system so that they will flow just the same. Is there anything popping in the chat that I've missed, Jess? Anybody wants to add to this part of the componentry? And then I'll jump into a little bit of disc brakes.
Someone just wants to know if there's any major differences in these steps between a nicer road bike versus a bike like yours, Galen.
Ooh, good question. Let me demonstrate with my touring bike. And I'm just going to get my mountain bike out of here. Pardon me for a second. Hard to do everything over Zoom when you don't have a team with you. I appreciate your patience. Let's demo on my road style touring bike. The biggest difference, I would say, is what type of components you have will change how you access the exterior and how you would clean it off. So similarly to the external shifter of the derailleur on the front and rear, I would do the same of a little bit of a dab of grease right where the springs are that moves the chain back and forth on this bike. The difference with this bike, twofold. One is the braking and gearing shifters are all integrated in with my, ooh, that's a really good point. Yeah, somebody mentioned put a rug or other container on the floor to catch the drips, because you will be dripping greasing agents on the floor, which is why I do it in my laundry room. Great point. You'll see that in order to access my cabling, I can't do the same unhooking of my cable because it's all integrated into here. So if I was concerned about some griminess and grittiness, I would find a little gap, potentially depending on how your cabling system works. And I would use a similar kind of like spray and just kind of jump in there. And a little hard to see because my light, let me change my light for you. Kind of just get the hose in there and then just spray. Sorry, my hands, I realize is blocking it. And get that grease to settle in. You can kind of see it's coming from the T9 can into where the springs and the cabling systems lock into place. This is primarily where most of the griminess comes from, because this is the most exposed area of these cabling systems for the most part. Your bike might be different, but getting a little bit of a spray lubricant just in there, dousing it in there, especially if you're having trouble shifting, that will give it about 15 minutes. I guarantee you, you'll notice more springiness and notice more poppiness. So that's one way to think about it. Where on your bike do you have those little gaps where the cabling systems come in, where the springs are, anything that might be exposed, and try to find ways of putting a little bit of lubrication in the cabling system, letting the capillary system work to kind of let the lubrication flow throughout the channels of the housing and the cable, and make sure that whatever your bike has, there will be differences. So study it and be pretty keen on it as well. Let's talk a little bit about disc brakes while I have you with this bike. So on this bike, you'll see that the disc brakes are fairly exposed. The cool thing about disc brakes, however, though, is the braking mechanism itself is smaller, so it attracts less grime and less grit. And it is more or less covered so that the pads themselves have protection, versus on a road bike or a rim brake bike where the pads are the rubber that are hitting on the rim. I don't want to get into too much of the disc brake because I feel like everybody's a little bit different and every bike has particularities about how the cabling system works or the hydraulic system works. But one thing which is universal for disc brakes is the way that you clean it. The cleaning solution for disc brakes really is rubbing alcohol. This is to be applied to the rotor itself and not to really anywhere else, although you could put it on the brake mechanism itself, but again, it's not a lubricant, so it doesn't really help facilitate movement. But what this does is it cleans off the grit. And the reason that we want rubbing alcohol is because it dissolves and evaporates without leaving a residue. The trouble with a simple green is that it leaves a little bit of a film. Trouble with a WD-40 is that it will leave a gap and not actually fill it with anything like a greasing agent. And this is very caustic. So you don't want any of this on your brake rotors themselves. This would be for unseizing. So I go so far as to use something like isopropyl alcohol. This is 91 proof. I don't care if you use 70 proof, 80 proof, whatever it might be. The higher the proof, the sooner it evaporates. That's something to keep in mind. But really, isopropyl alcohol is the key. And all you really need to do, let me see if I can get my light a little bit more, is really just find a clean spot on your Bike Month t-shirt, douse it in rubbing alcohol, and then just wipe the rotors. And again, you only want rubbing alcohol because there's no residue. If you do use a solvent or cleaning agent, that could then get translated onto the brake pads, in which case you'll need to replace the brake pads because once the brake pads get contaminated, there's nothing you can really do to clean them off. So just keeping isopropyl alcohol handy for your disc brake rotors is key. You can also do this similarly for your rim brakes if you have them. Although rim brakes are a little bit less finicky, but you can see that I even got some of that grime and stuff off of my rotor, which is absolutely key. I'll also maybe use rubbing alcohol on my rims once I'm done with my rotor. And it's a kind of a blessing to see that as I wipe off the salt and sand, it becomes clean again. And you can see a lot of that grit and grime that I'm just wiping off. And the reason that I want rubbing alcohol for my brakes is because you don't want at all to play around with your brakes. You don't want at all to inhibit the friction between the rubber and the rotor or the rubber and the rim. You want to be able to stop quick and clean and make sure that you are in control of your bike at all times. So got to make sure your brakes work. Rubbing alcohol is the key for that. And then let's see here if I can find my top, which I can't, no worries. Let's see. And then the last thing I'll mention too, while I have you, and I realize we're going to go a few minutes over, but this one's key as well, is that as you are out there in the wintertime, you're going to be collecting the salt and sand on your bike, just generally, not just in the drivetrain, not just in the cabling, not just on the brakes, but throughout the whole bike. I do recommend having some way to wash it off with warm water. Don't need a soap, really. You just need a warm water and a rag. I highly recommend getting a watering can as opposed to any sort of hose or any sort of things that device that would actually put force into the water. Because if you are washing off your bike with a hose, you can actually dissolve some of that salt and make it salt water and then force it into the componentry, which is exactly what you don't want to do. So what I'll do is I'll just grab some warm water and it's a little off screen, but I do have a sink down here. I'll add a little bit of warm water. And then with that, this is also key, whoever mentioned getting a piece of cardboard under your bike or having somewhere that you can make a little bit of wetness. I forgot to mention that. Thank you for bringing that up. Just kind of pouring warm water over your bike, which is fine. Bikes are meant to be outdoor creatures. They are meant to go out in the rain. What you have to worry about is the salt and the sand. So as long as you've got a little bit of water, just like literally, I would rinse my bike and then I'd take my Bike Month t-shirt rags, same deal, and just kind of start wiping it down as well. Don't recommend a hose. All I recommend is a watering can. And with that, I would say that every time that you ride in the salt and sand, before you bring your bike in, brush off the stuff, brush off the slush, brush off the gunk. And then if you want to go so far as every so often getting a nice little watering can full of warm water, and you'll see a big difference of cleaning off some of that sand and salt. It's a little bit less of a concern if it's on the frame, but just to make sure that you want to keep your bike nice and happy, just go through it and do it as such. I realized that we went through a lot, but then also only covered the surface of the bare bones of what we can get through. But I'll take a quick pause here. Happy to stick around. Is there anything else in the chat or anybody else want to unmute and chime in with some of the things I might have missed or want to add to the conversation? And thank you so much for joining for this hour. I realized it was wham bam in my bike room, but I really appreciate your time and attention here. And maybe I'll pass it to Jess to help lead any sort of conversation who folks might be able to join. And again, check out more of this on massbike.org, and we'll have this up on our webinars page as well.
We have a question about how to remove rust.
Good question. So the best way to remove rust is, honestly, in my experience, depending on where the rust is, if it's on the frame, you can actually get at it with a little bit of steel wool to kind of dig at the rust. And then you want to cover it with some sort of paint, nail polish, or some sort of seal, so that though you've exposed more of your frame by getting more of the rust out, you are protecting it still. Where there's a ding, this is a steel bike, by the way, so if I get a ding in it, it can rust out. If I ride it through the winter, that rust could actually eat through and destroy my frame. So if I'm starting to notice rust in here, literally a bit of steel wool just to scrape it off, but then you're not done. You really do need to coat it with something. Nail polish, clear nail polish, or a nail polish that matches the color of your frame is also a great way to do it. There might be other suggestions that folks have out there, but that's what I've done in the past.
I'm getting that aluminum foil is handy and works on chrome.
Perfect.
And do you have any special suggestions for getting the salt grime off at the end of the ride if you're living in an apartment and you don't have a great place to do so outside?
Yeah, the watering can is really my go-to. Just get a good watering can that you can fill up in your kitchen and come down and just rinse it off. Ideally, you want to do all the cleaning as much as possible outdoors before you bring your bike inside, so that it doesn't drip that salt and sand. You can find probably a little spot in your backyard or on the sidewalk where you can do this without leaving too much of a mess. But everything that I've done here has been within like a 4-foot by 5-foot span. I do have a bike stand I didn't use. I didn't talk about removing the wheels. I didn't talk about some of the more extensive stuff that might be harder to do. But I would say, just getting a rag, some gloves, and some solvents and some lubes, doing it on the sidewalk is probably totally fine. But the other key I would also recommend is if you are riding regularly every day in the slush and sand, have a little broom next to your door, and you can literally also brush off the stuff while it's still frozen before you actually bring your bike indoors, and that'll save you a lot of the hassle because you'll already have it off the bike before you bring it inside.
Any specific tips for belt drive bikes with internal gearing? Do they need lubrication?
No lubrication needed, not on the chain at least. You might need lubrication, at least maybe some thicker stuff, especially if like I was mentioning, the rotational systems, to keep an eye on those. The beauty of belt drives is they don't stretch like a chain stretches, like I mentioned earlier, and they don't necessarily need lubrication because they're like a carbon fiber rubber, so there's no real metal to be lubricated. So no, I don't necessarily have a good idea of that. And I do know that if it's an internal drive where you can shift internally, you might need to keep an eye on if there's a cable pull system for the shifter. So similarly to, as I mentioned about lubricating the cabling system a little bit with a dab of lube here and there, that'll probably be the same that you can do for your internal shifting system. But the drive itself, I don't think that what I've talked about necessarily pertains to it. And I see there's more popping in the chat, so this is awesome. We'll also keep this chat saved for everybody so that we can
yeah, there's a couple questions about different types of chain cleaners, like the devices that you use with soap and water before applying a lubrication, or one with a catch.
Excellent. Yeah, there's things that are out there like the pig cleaner from Pedros and a few others. Park Tool has one. All the major bike brands do have this extra kind of contraption, we'll call it, which encapsulates the chain, and you can put soapy water in it. And as you run the chain through it, it basically cleans out, like I was mentioning earlier, with the internals, it does a really good job of getting at the inside of all of this stuff. So I would say go for it if you want to. And again, this was kind of designed to make it as easy as possible that you could probably do without needing too much extra componentry. But if you wanted to buy a specific chain cleaner that's made by one of the bike brands, they're about 30 bucks, I would say. It's worth it. But again, it's only the cleaning, it's not the lubrication. So after you've already cleaned off the chain through the degreasing stuff and the soap and water, you will still need to apply lubrication. Every link where the links meet needs to have a drop of lube or more, let it soak through and then be wiped down afterwards. So it's an added step, but by all means, you can go ahead and do that. And I think that's totally fine as well. Yep, I'm looking through here too. This is some great information. I thanks everybody for chiming in with your own tips here, and I really appreciate that. This is some really good tips. Yeah, a little bit more. What else I can mention? Lastly, again, some like soap goes a really long way afterwards for your hands. I recommend, dishwashing soap also works really well too, but you're going to get greasy, and it's okay to get greasy. It's okay to get a little grime under your fingernails. You got to clean it off, but just be sure that you're keeping yourself clean just the same. Yeah, and I'm happy to stick around. What other ideas might we have in there?
I just popped our post-event survey in the chat for everyone. I'll also be sending out an email with the link to the recording once we have it up, just so everyone is aware.
Excellent. Yeah, really appreciate it. And again, just to recap, keep an eye on the rotational systems. Pay extra attention for cleaning off the chain and the derailleur system. Wiping it down, lubing it up, waiting and wiping is the key. And then for the cabling systems, anything a little particular, you add a little drop of lubrication here and there. The spray lube goes wonders for getting inside of the cabling systems. Using rubbing alcohol wherever possible on brakes so that you are not necessarily adding any slickness to where we need friction. Keeping an eye on everything too. So if you start to see little bits and flakes of rust, that's a great question of you can wipe it off and seal it. And then just anything that seems like there's a spring or there's exposed metal that needs to move. Being pretty liberal with a dab or two of the same lubrication that you'd use for your chain goes a really long way of just making sure that you're actually able to keep springy, keep active, and keep moving and keep fluid. What about the pedals I'm seeing here from Richard? Good question. Depending on what type of pedals you have, pedals do rotate and spin. So that would be, again, part of the rotational system. Like there are ball bearings inside of most pedals, which do, if they start to wobble, will need to be serviced or replaced. If you have the clip-in style, like I have here with the clipless pedals, it's a little hard to see, but the same idea of adding a dab of lubrication to the springs of the pedals, you can also do, where did my spray lube go? I can take this stuff and just, in the exposed spring area, I can just do a little dab of the pedals. If I do want to clip in, just the same to keep those nice and springy. I wouldn't need to do it for the cleats. It's really just where the cleats lock in to the pedal itself, but a little dab, just the same, because there is a spring, I can see it, and I can see if that spring gets rusty. If the pedals stop spinning, there's an internal ball bearing system that needs to be serviced or replaced. That does wear out. I should also kind of remind us, again, your bike does wear out. Your bike will need to be serviced and have componentry replaced. The only thing I like to say that doesn't wear out on a bike should be the frame. Eventually, everything else might fail. Things will fail sooner than others. Tires go first, chains go, brake pads go. But I've cracked a seat post. I've had to replace it. I've had to replace the headset. I've had to replace my handlebar. Like everything, if the frame is gone, your bike is shot. But every other part of the bike can, and maybe every so often needs to be serviced. So keeping that in mind. But again, the things to really keep in mind are where the drivetrain is the most sensitive, keeping an eye on the pedaling and the rotational systems and making sure that, yes, you can brake nice and strong. Yes, you can pedal and shift nice and strong, and that you're not letting that salt and sand eat away at stuff. And I will say that I have ruined a few frames in my day by letting them get rusted. And I had a very similar bike to this where I got a hole down here in the chainstay that got filled with salt water because I was riding in the wintertime. It ate through the back of the bike. I noticed a hole and it was heartbreaking because I basically had to toss my bike and go get a new one because unless I was going to try to weld a whole little piece onto it, it's compromised and needs to go. With that said, if my chain's worn out, whatever, I get a new chain. It happens. Brake pads wear out, get a new brake pad. It happens. I get a new rotor for my disc brakes. It happens. And I actually would high five you if you did need to get a whole new chain and drivetrain system, because that means that you were riding your bike. And that's what we want. I don't want your bike to be spotless. If you have a white bike and it stays white, you're not doing your job. Go ride your bike, go get it greasy, go get it dirty. So don't let your bike stay too clean, but make sure that you're doing what you need to do to make sure that your bike is safe and happy to ride.
So we have a question about lubricants, and I've heard this too, is should you stay with one lubricant for the chain? So say you start using one type and you want to swap, should you stay with one type of lubricant or can you switch between them?
Oh, great question. Different types of lubricants are made for different conditions. So the thick stuff here that I have to shake up because it's got wax in it, it's thicker and it lasts longer. So if it's raining out, I'll probably use this type of stuff. If it's wet season, we do it typically by the seasons. If I'm going to be riding in the wetness I'll use a thicker lubricant because it lasts longer, doesn't break down as easily. In the summertime, in the drier conditions, I'll use a thinner stuff because it acts a little bit more as a solvent, will soak through the chain, and then I only need to do one step. I don't need to add the degreaser and then lube it afterwards. I can just use this stuff and it will soak through and kind of get out that grime. And in its place, it puts lubrication. I would say that if you're in a process of cleaning a chain and you're only going to, like, in the moment, sticking with one lubricant is fine. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily recommend putting the thinner stuff and then immediately putting the thicker stuff. That to me doesn't make any sense. There might be a reason that you've thought of that I just don't know. It's totally fine. But I would say it really depends on the weather that you're going to be riding in, whether it's thinner or thicker. Cool, cool. The rider does wear out. Yes, I would say so. And you can choose your beverage of choice for your own type of lubrication. That's totally fine.
And I got one more question about hosing down the bike regularly to get salt and sand off. Good or bad idea?
I don't necessarily recommend a hose unless you can have a very light pressure. And again, it's because there's so much, especially down in the drivetrain area, that is sensitive that you don't necessarily want salt water to get inside of that stuff, which is why I recommend a watering can because it's such light pressure along with wiping it down. However, if you've got a warm water hose that is very light pressure and just getting at it, that's fine as well. But I would caution you there and just recommend that if you're doing water that you really use a brush or a rag to really get that salt and really wipe it down, and don't use the force of the water as a pressure system to get that salt and sand off, just for the risk of getting it inside of the componentry. And there's stuff, especially in the hubs of the wheels, where the wheels spin, which do have little cracks in them, and they do get moisture. And if that moisture is salt moisture, that is going to eat away at the ball bearings, eat away at the grease system, and you'll prematurely wear away at the rotational systems. So yes, but with caution. Cool. And I realize that this is just my own way. So you're going to have your own way, and you're going to have your own tips. You're going to have your own tricks. Some people really like soapy water. Great. Just know that soapy water is just the first step, and then you got to move on to actually making sure that the things that need grease do get grease. And depending on what you ride in, if you only ride in the dry conditions, you're going to have less of a concern about that salt getting in there. But it really kind of depends on your own ride, your own bike. Again, I had 3 different bikes here that were all a little bit different. I guarantee your bike doesn't fit any of them, and they will be completely separate. So keep in mind that the ABCs of kind of cleaning it off, making sure that the chain itself is probably the most important with the C side of things, making sure that and the drivetrain and the cabling system. The B side for the brakes, to make sure that your brakes are as debris free as possible and using something that will evaporate. And then for making sure that we don't really have an A, I mean, you could kind of wipe down your tires and make sure your tires are clean too, but really for the A side of things, making sure that the area around where the contact is for the tires stays relatively debris free, but more it's about the rotational systems of the hubs, the headset, and the spindle for the axle aren't wobbly as they wear out. That's just something to keep in mind as well. That's a longer term wearing, but it's something that you want to keep an eye on too, because once it starts to wear, there's no helping it. You have to fix the problem, or else it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. Cool. I realize we're a little bit longer than 1, so I appreciate everyone sticking around. I'm happy to stick around and keep it going, but I want to say thank you so much for taking this. I know it's a quick intro. If you have any other questions, again, hit up your local bike shop. They've got all of this stuff available. They've got grease, they've got the solvents, they've got the spray lubes. Do what you can, and then keep in touch with Mass Bike, because we are also expanding all this knowledge. We'll probably put this out in a blog post and encourage people to participate. This is not the be all end all of cleaning your bike. This is just kind of an idea of what to keep in mind, and to really remind you that it is something that's your responsibility to do the basics at home. So again, find yourself a little space that's not very crowded, and see what you can do. And if you make a little bit of a mess like I did, again, I probably should have prefaced it by saying, lay down some cardboard, lay down a tub, so that if you do get a little messy, it's not going to make a big old spot in your laundry room like I did.
And we just have a question from a daily commuter. How often should a daily commuter be cleaning their bike off?
Oh, good question. If you ride in today, you're going to want to wipe it down afterwards. Again, it's the conditions. In the wintertime, honestly, I might do this like almost weekly if I'm just cleaning off my chain, just my chain, probably about weekly to put some lubrication on. Or if you notice it starts to get orange on the chain or sounds like you've got a family of mice, take care of it. The longer you let it sit, the worse it will get. It does not fix itself. So just like you would, say you went on a snowy hike, you'd brush off your boots before coming into the house. Kind of do the same for the bike. And because if you're a daily commuter, your bike is actually probably your connection to the world. It's your way to get to work. It's your way to get to the store. It's your way to get freedom. Treat it proper. Treat it like you love it. And the longer you let it get rusty, the longer you let it wear out, the harder it's going to be to bring it back to life. So I don't necessarily say 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. It really kind of depends on your own situation. I might say like every week or two, I will do this to my chain if I'm riding every day. But if it's a particularly snowy day, if I'm going to go riding this afternoon while it's actively snowing and the salt trucks are out and the sand trucks are out, I might do it tonight before I bring my bike in, just so that it doesn't sit overnight and kind of collect all the grime. Great. And again, we'll send this out in a blog post. We'll have all the tips written down. We'll have the materials that you requested and feedback. We'll do a survey. Please be honest. We're happy to change this up and augment. And we've got some more webinars coming up. I should mention that next week, we're going to be talking about bike touring. We have our spectacular Safe Routes to Schools instructor, Randy, who's going to talk about a trip that she took in 2017, where she went up to Maine and biked all throughout from the Boston up to the coast of Maine, and then all around Nova Scotia and up into the Cabot Trail up in Cape Breton, which hopefully is inspiring you. And if the walls are closing in just like they are for all of us out there, maybe this is a respite for you to think about what the wonderful world awaits you once we are able to go and travel and are able to go and ride bikes. So come to that if you are able. I believe it's next Monday in the evening, and some more information about that on our website, and we'll probably throw that in the chat as well. So please plug in with Mass Bike. We've got a lot of stuff coming up, and we're here for you. Again, this is just some of the stuff that we're doing, but if there's more that you would like to know, we're here to be a resource for you.